It was during the hours when most of the city slept that Marcus Holbrook felt the most awake. Cincinnati at 2 in the morning was a different place. The highways still breathed, but slowly. The Ohio River moved like a dark ribbon through the city, reflecting scattered lights that never seemed to blink. And high above the quiet streets, inside a small radio booth on the 3rd floor of an old warehouse near the riverfront, Marcus sat alone with a microphone and a stack of vinyl records. For 7 years, this had been his world. The overnight shift at WKRF was not glamorous. There were no guests, no breaking news, no applause. Just music, weather updates, and the occasional voice breaking the silence through a blinking phone line. Marcus had learned early that the night belonged to a specific kind of person. Truck drivers pushing through long highways, nurses on late rotations, factory workers finishing shifts that left their bodies tired but their minds restless, and others who never explained why they were awake, only that they were. He spoke to them softly, never rushing, never forcing energy that did not belong to that hour. His voice had become calm over the years, measured, almost intimate. Listeners often said it felt less like a radio show and more like a conversation meant only for them. Marcus did not plan this life. He had studied journalism years earlier, believing he might one day chase stories instead of playing records. But the market had been unforgiving, and radio had offered something steadier. By the time he realized he was drifting rather than choosing, the overnight shift had already become routine. Routine was something Marcus relied on. His apartment mirrored his schedule. Blackout curtains blocked the afternoon sun. Breakfast food filled the refrigerator, eaten at dusk. Dinner happened as the sky began to pale near dawn. Neighbors rarely saw him. When they did, they exchanged polite confusion with the pale man returning home as they left for work. Marcus existed slightly out of sync with everyone else. After his divorce, the solitude became easier to accept. The radio booth felt safer than most places. Inside it, the world was predictable. Records followed a schedule. Weather forecasts arrived on time. Calls came and went. And then there was Victor. Marcus could not remember the exact night Victor first called, only that it was summer, warm even after midnight, and that the voice on the other end of the line sounded thoughtful rather than tired. Victor never asked for songs. He called to talk. At first, their conversations were brief. A few comments about a book, a passing observation about architecture in the city, nothing remarkable. But Victor kept calling, once a week at first, then twice, always between 2 and 3 in the morning, always calm, always measured. His accent was noticeable but difficult to place, European, Marcus assumed, not heavy enough to raise questions, just enough to be interesting. Victor spoke with care, choosing words slowly, pausing as if shaping ideas before letting them out. He seemed to enjoy the silence between sentences, something few callers tolerated. Over time, the conversations grew longer. They talked about American literature, about old bridges and forgotten buildings, about how cities remembered their past even when people didn't. Marcus found himself looking forward to those calls. In the isolated world of overnight radio, familiarity carried weight. Victor did not feel like a stranger. He felt like someone who understood the rhythm of the night. Marcus began to imagine him without realizing it, perhaps a retired professor, a widower living alone, someone with time, books, and thoughts that needed somewhere to go. Victor never mentioned family, never spoke about work, never talked about daily routines. Their connection existed only in sound. Other staff members noticed. Teresa, the production director, sometimes stopped by with coffee during Marcus's shift. She listened quietly when Victor called, smiling at the thoughtful exchanges. "He sounds interesting," she once said, like someone who actually listens. Marcus agreed. In a world filled with rushed voices and shallow chatter, Victor felt different. And for nearly 2 years, that was all Victor was. A voice in the night. Until one evening in November, when Marcus arrived at the station and found a note taped to the booth door. The station manager wanted to see him before he went on air. That alone was unusual. Management rarely involved itself with the overnight shift. Marcus's show ran quietly, efficiently, and without incident. As he walked down the hallway toward the office, Marcus felt a faint tension in his chest, the kind that appeared when routine cracked unexpectedly.
He had no idea that by the end of that conversation, the quiet world he had built around radio waves and late-night voices would never feel the same again. And that one familiar caller would no longer sound harmless.
Marcus did not expect the meeting to take long. He assumed it would be something minor. A programming question, a scheduling detail, maybe a reminder about station policy. The station manager, Gerald Richmond, sat behind his desk when Marcus entered, his expression unreadable. The office smelled faintly of old paper and stale coffee, the kind of place where decisions were made quietly and rarely explained. Gerald did not waste time. 2 men had arrived earlier that evening. They had shown credentials. They were waiting in the conference room. They were from the FBI. For a moment, Marcus was certain he had misheard. The word did not fit his life. It belonged to headlines, to television dramas, to worlds far removed from a late-night radio booth and stacks of vinyl records. "What could they possibly want with me?" Marcus asked. Gerald shook his head. "They wouldn't say. They asked specifically for you." As Marcus followed him down the hallway, his mind raced through harmless possibilities. Had a caller made a threat? Had he violated some obscure broadcasting regulation? None of it made sense. The conference room lights felt harsh. 2 figures stood as Marcus entered, both dressed conservatively, their movements controlled, practiced. Introductions were brief. They asked him to sit. The older agent spoke first. His tone was calm, almost apologetic. They were not there because Marcus was in trouble. They were there because of someone who called his show. The name came next. Victor. The relief Marcus felt was immediate, followed quickly by confusion. "What about him?" Marcus asked. "He's just a listener." The agents exchanged a glance before sliding a photograph across the table. It showed a man walking along a city street, captured from a distance. Angular features, wire-rimmed glasses, a posture that suggested alertness rather than ease. Marcus studied the image carefully. He did not recognize the face, yet something about it felt familiar. Not visually. Something else. The agent asked if Marcus had ever met the man. Marcus shook his head. "He's never come to the station. I only know him from the calls." They asked about the conversations. What did Victor talk about? Did he ask personal questions? Did he seem curious about Marcus's schedule, his habits, his routines? Marcus answered honestly. No. If anything, Victor was careful to avoid personal topics. He spoke about books, history, architecture. Ideas, not people. The agents took notes. Then the explanation came, carefully worded, measured. The man Marcus knew as Victor was not who he claimed to be. He was a Soviet intelligence officer. The words landed without drama, but they carried weight. Marcus felt the room tilt slightly, as if gravity had shifted. "That's impossible," he said. "He sounds like an academic. He talks about poetry." The agents did not argue. They explained that deep-cover operatives were trained to sound exactly like that building a convincing identity often meant living it completely. Victor had been in the United States for years. He worked quietly, paid taxes, volunteered, lived a life that attracted no attention. And yet, he was not what he seemed. Marcus listened, struggling to reconcile the man on the phone with the figure in the photograph. They told him they had been monitoring Victor for months, that his calls to the radio station had drawn attention, not because of what was said, but because of when and how often they occurred. Patterns mattered. The agents were careful not to speculate aloud. They did not claim Victor was transmitting messages. They did not accuse Marcus of being involved. Instead, they spoke about uncertainty, about possibilities that could not be dismissed. During the Cold War, ordinary things were sometimes used in extraordinary ways. Radio was one of them. Late-night broadcasts, anonymous callers, public signals heard by anyone but understood by few. They did not say this was happening, only that they could not rule it out. Marcus realized then that what unsettled him most was not the accusation itself. It was the shift in perspective. Every conversation he had enjoyed now existed under a shadow. Every pause, every choice of topic, every casual observation felt suddenly fragile. The agents asked Marcus to continue exactly as he had before.
To take Victor's calls, to keep the conversations natural. All they wanted was observation, time, topics, anything unusual. They were not asking him to investigate. They were asking him not to change. Marcus asked what would happen if he refused. They told him he was not obligated, but they asked him to consider what might be at stake. National security was mentioned, not dramatically, but plainly. Lives were mentioned, just once. When the meeting ended, Marcus returned to the booth with a strange sense of detachment. The microphone looked the same. The turntable spun the same way. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. He went on air that night out of habit. His voice sounded normal to listeners, smooth, unhurried. Inside, his thoughts moved in tight circles. When the phone lines lit up, his chest tightened. Victor did not call that night, or the next. When he finally did, days later, the familiar voice filled the booth again, calm and cultured, asking about a poem Marcus had mentioned earlier in the week. To anyone listening, it sounded like nothing had changed. But Marcus listened differently now. He heard pauses where he hadn't before. He noticed patterns he had never questioned. He wondered, without wanting to, whether meaning could hide inside ordinary words, and whether the quiet hours he once found comforting had always carried something else beneath the surface. After that night, nothing about Marcus's routine truly returned to normal. On the surface, his life remained unchanged. He arrived at the station at the same hour, unlocked the same door, sat in the same chair beneath the dim studio lights. But the way he listened had changed. Marcus had always considered himself a good listener. Radio demanded it. You learned to hear not just words, but tone, hesitation, emotion. Now, listening became something else. Every call carried weight. Every silence lingered longer than it used to. When Victor spoke, Marcus tracked details he once ignored. The rhythm of breathing. The way topics were entered and left behind. The return to familiar themes. Victor did not change. That constancy unsettled Marcus more than anything else. The conversations flowed as they always had. Literature. Architecture. Cities shaped by memory. After each call, Marcus followed the instructions given to him. He noted the time, the duration, the topics discussed. At first, the process felt mechanical, like paperwork for a role he had never chosen. But over time, the effect deepened. Marcus began to feel as though he was observing his own life from a distance, as if conversation itself had become something staged. He replayed calls long after his shift ended, not because of what was said, but because of what might be heard differently by someone listening with another purpose. He did not believe Victor was sending messages, but he understood why the agents could not dismiss the possibility entirely. During the Cold War, uncertainty was part of the landscape. It shaped decisions. It justified caution. Marcus had never lived with that kind of uncertainty before. Sleep became difficult. When he lay down during the day, his mind refused to slow. Voices replayed themselves. Not just Victor's, but others as well. A truck driver calling in from the highway. A nurse asking for a song. A man discussing road conditions late at night. Marcus began to notice how much information people shared without realizing it. Not secrets. Just fragments. Enough, he realized, to build patterns if someone wanted to. At the station, colleagues noticed the change. Teresa commented that Marcus seemed distracted, quieter than usual off-air. He blamed it on exhaustion. Years of night shifts catching up with him. That explanation was true, in a way, just not complete.
The FBI did not call often. When they did, their questions were precise, factual. Had Victor changed his calling pattern? Had he asked new kinds of questions? Had anything felt out of place? Marcus answered no, because nothing had. That was the problem. Victor remained consistent, predictable, almost assuring. The absence of obvious signals made everything feel heavier. Marcus began to understand something unsettling. If Victor was involved in something larger, it did not require him to behave differently. It required him to behave exactly the same. The idea lodged itself in Marcus's thoughts and refused to leave. Routine, he realized, could be camouflage. As weeks passed, Marcus found himself withdrawing emotionally from callers. He shortened conversations, avoided drifting too far into personal territory. The intimacy he once valued began to feel dangerous. He missed it. He missed the ease with which conversations used to flow, the simple pleasure of connecting with someone without suspicion. Victor noticed none of this. Or if he did, he gave no sign. One night, after a particularly long call about American poetry, Marcus sat alone in the booth, the record spinning silently as he delayed starting the next track. He stared at the phone lines, all dark now. For the first time, he wondered whether Victor felt the same weight. Whether the man on the other end of the line also lived inside a carefully maintained routine. Whether those conversations were the only place where he allowed himself to sound like who he truly was. The thought disturbed Marcus more than the idea of espionage itself. It suggested something human beneath the deception, and that made everything harder to hold at a distance. By the time winter deepened and snow settled along the riverfront, Marcus no longer thought of the radio booth as a refuge. It had become a listening post. Not because he wanted it to be, but because it no longer felt possible to hear voices without wondering who else might be listening. The first real change did not announce itself dramatically. There was no sudden confession, no coded sentence that revealed its meaning, no moment Marcus could point to and say, "This is where everything changed." It arrived quietly, disguised as a question. It was late January, deep winter. The city moved slower then. Snow lingered along the sidewalks, gray and packed down by weeks of passing cars. Victor called at his usual time. His voice sounded the same. Calm. Cultured. They spoke briefly about the cold, about how certain cities seemed to grow quieter in winter, as if retreating inward. Then Victor asked something Marcus had never been asked before. It was not personal in the obvious sense, not a question about Marcus's schedule or private life. It was about a place. Victor mentioned Indiana. Casually. Almost as an aside. He said he had been reading about mid-century architecture and wondered whether Marcus had ever visited the town of Columbus, whether he remembered a particular modernist library there. The question was unremarkable on its own. Marcus answered honestly. Yes, he had been there as a child. His uncle had lived nearby. The building Victor mentioned was hard to forget. Victor seemed satisfied. He thanked Marcus and moved the conversation elsewhere, back into safer territory. The call ended as it always did, politely, without urgency. Marcus sat still for a moment after hanging up. Nothing about the exchange felt overtly wrong. Yet something about the precision of the question unsettled him. Victor had never before asked anything that intersected so directly with Marcus's past. It was subtle. Easy to dismiss. Marcus did not trust his instincts anymore, so he did not dismiss it. He made his notes. He reported the call.
The response from the agents came sooner than usual. They asked Marcus to come in the following day. This time, the tone of the meeting was different. Not alarmed, focused. They told Marcus that the question about Columbus stood out, not because of what it referenced, but because of how specific it was. Verification questions, they said, did not always sound suspicious. Often they sounded ordinary. In some cases, such questions could serve to confirm identity, not directly, but by narrowing possibilities. Marcus struggled with the idea. He had not been asked for information. He had not revealed anything secret. The agents did not disagree. That uncertainty, they explained, was exactly what made the question worth noting. If someone were listening, someone already familiar with parts of Marcus's background, the answer might confirm authenticity. Not for Marcus, possibly for someone else. The thought made his stomach tighten. Marcus asked whether this meant he was the intended contact. The agents said they did not believe so. Not yet. They believed Marcus's identity might be serving as a reference point, a fixed signal, something stable enough to be used without suspicion. Marcus realized then how small his role actually was. He was not the target. He was not the asset. He was context. The agents instructed him to continue as before, but now they asked him to listen differently. Not just to Victor, to everyone. They were looking for someone else, someone who might reference the same details, someone who might mirror pieces of Marcus's life too closely. Marcus returned to the station that night with a heightened awareness he could not turn off. Every call felt heavier. He caught himself waiting for patterns that might never appear, listening for echoes that could be coincidence or design. Victor continued calling. The tone did not change. If he was aware of anything unfolding beneath the surface, he concealed it well. Marcus wondered whether Victor understood how fragile the situation had become, whether he sensed the shift or whether routine protected him just as it protected Marcus. Radio, Marcus realized, had become something different entirely. It was no longer a place where voices drifted in and out without consequence. It was a space where identities could overlap, where ordinary details could be repurposed without the speaker ever knowing. The thought followed him long after his shifts ended. He no longer trusted coincidence. He no longer trusted familiarity. The quiet hours he once loved now felt exposed, as if the darkness itself were listening back. And somewhere within that darkness, Marcus understood that the story he thought he was part of had expanded beyond him. He was no longer the center of it. He was a piece moving inside something larger, something unfolding slowly and deliberately, without urgency, without noise, which made it far more dangerous. The call came on a night that felt no different from the others. Marcus was halfway through his shift, the city outside wrapped in the kind of quiet that made even passing cars sound distant. Snow had stopped falling days earlier, but the cold remained, pressing itself against the studio windows. The phone line lit up. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar. A woman. She sounded younger than most of Marcus's regular callers. Careful, slightly tense, as if she had rehearsed what she was about to say and still wasn't sure it sounded right. She introduced herself with a first name and a neighborhood. Nothing unusual. She told Marcus she had been listening to the show for some time. Long enough, she said, to recognize certain conversations when they returned. She enjoyed the moments when the show drifted toward architecture. Marcus acknowledged her politely, ready to move the call along. Then she mentioned Columbus. Not abruptly, not dramatically. She referenced a discussion from weeks earlier, the one Marcus had nearly convinced himself meant nothing. She said her father had worked in architecture, that Columbus had always fascinated her. Marcus felt a flicker of recognition that made him sit a little straighter in his chair. He responded carefully. He did not volunteer details. He did not shut the conversation down. Let it unfold. The caller asked whether Marcus had spent much time there as a child, whether he remembered certain buildings, whether he had family connections to the area. The questions were framed casually. The tone remained conversational. To anyone listening, it would have sounded like a harmless exchange between strangers sharing an interest. Marcus answered truthfully, but sparingly. He felt acutely aware of the balance he needed to maintain. Too little engagement might appear unnatural. Too much might provide more than he intended. When the call ended, Marcus did not hesitate. He documented it. He reported it. The agents contacted him within hours. They asked Marcus to walk them through the conversation again, slowly, in detail. They did not tell him what they thought, but Marcus could hear it in the way they listened. The pieces were beginning to align. Over the following days, Marcus replayed the call in his mind. He noticed how the woman's questions had mirrored Victor's earlier interest, how the details overlapped just enough to feel intentional, without being obvious. Marcus understood now what the agents meant when they spoke about patterns. No single call mattered on its own. It was the repetition, the echoes. The FBI began paying closer attention to new callers, not publicly, not in ways Marcus could see, but their questions became more specific. They asked about tone, about hesitation, about references that seemed to connect back to previous conversations. Marcus felt himself becoming quieter on air, more controlled. He was no longer just hosting a radio show. He was maintaining an environment, one where nothing appeared forced, one where nothing appeared avoided.
Victor continued to call. His voice remained steady. If he was aware that someone else had entered the orbit of the show, he did not indicate it. But Marcus began to notice something subtle. Victor returned to Columbus again in conversation. Not insistently, just enough. He spoke about possibly visiting the town himself, about wanting to see the buildings in person. Marcus did not respond beyond polite acknowledgement. After the call, he felt a tightening in his chest that he had come to recognize. This was no longer coincidence. Still, nothing had happened. No instructions, no exchange. Just voices drifting across radio waves. Marcus felt caught in the middle of something that moved at a pace he could not control. He was not being rushed. He was being used for stability, for consistency. The idea unsettled him deeply. It suggested patience, planning, and a confidence that time was not an enemy. By now, Marcus understood that the story unfolding around him was not built on urgency. It was built on waiting. And waiting, he realized, was far more difficult to endure. What unsettled Marcus most was how little actually changed. There was no rush, no sudden escalation. The calls continued. The music played. The city slept. And yet, everything felt as though it were leaning towards something inevitable. Victor began to speak differently. Not in tone, not in manner, in direction. He mentioned travel, casually, as part of broader conversations about architecture and history. Cities worth visiting. Buildings that needed to be seen rather than read about. When Columbus came up again, it no longer felt incidental. Victor spoke about the town as though it were a place he would soon stand in. He mentioned timing, a possible weekend. Marcus listened carefully, offering nothing beyond acknowledgement. He did not ask questions. He had learned that asking too much could be as revealing as saying too much. After the call, Marcus contacted the agents as instructed. This time their response was immediate and direct. They told Marcus that what he was hearing aligned with what they expected. If Victor was moving beyond the radio, it meant something else had stabilized. Someone else had been identified. The radio show, they explained, was not the destination. It was the filter. The place where voices could circulate without consequence until the right connections formed. Marcus absorbed this quietly. He once believed that radio made people anonymous. Now he understood that it could also make them visible, if someone was patient enough. The agents asked Marcus to maintain absolute normalcy. No hesitation, no guardedness. Victor needed to believe that nothing had changed. Marcus wondered whether Victor believed that himself. Whether the radio booth was simply another role he stepped into each week, as practiced and controlled as the rest of his life. The pressure Marcus felt now was different. It was no longer rooted in fear of discovery. It was rooted in anticipation. The waiting. Each shift carried the same question beneath it. Would tonight be the night something crossed from sound into reality? Marcus found himself noticing the physical world more sharply. The way the studio door closed. The way the phone lines clicked. The way silence filled the booth between records. He imagined Victor doing the same somewhere else in the city. Listening. Waiting. And perhaps someone else as well. Another listener. Another voice. Another life intersecting with his own without consent. The agents did not tell Marcus what they were doing beyond the radio station. They did not need to. Marcus understood that whatever came next would not involve him directly. That was both a relief and a burden. He was close enough to feel the weight of what was unfolding, too far to influence it. One evening, after Victor ended a call earlier than usual, Marcus sat alone in the booth longer than necessary. The record spun in silence. For the first time, he felt certain of something. Whatever had begun as conversation had moved beyond conversation. The radio waves had done their work, and soon the story would leave the air entirely. Marcus did not witness the meeting. He would later understand that this was intentional. By the time events moved beyond the radio, his usefulness ended. Too much proximity would only complicate things. What he experienced instead was absence. Victor did not call on the night Marcus expected him to. The silence felt heavier than any conversation. When the phone lines remained dark through the quietest hours of the shift, Marcus understood that something had finally crossed a boundary. Whatever had been arranged no longer required the cover of casual conversation. The agents contacted Marcus the following day. Their tone was controlled but different. Focused. Deliberate. They did not share details. They did not need to. They confirmed only that Victor had left the city that morning, that surveillance had followed himself. Marcus did the math silently. Columbus. The town had shifted from abstraction to destination. Over the next 48 hours, Marcus returned to the radio booth as usual. He played records. He took calls. He spoke into the microphone with the same steady voice. But he knew the radio was no longer the center of the story. Somewhere else, beyond the reach of sound waves, the thing he had only overheard was unfolding in real time. The agents did not update him immediately. Marcus filled the silence with speculation he tried not to indulge. He imagined Victor sitting in a cafe, standing on a sidewalk, waiting. He wondered whether Victor felt relief or tension, whether the performance he had maintained for years had finally narrowed to a single moment. Marcus was not sure which would be worse. 2 days later, the call came. The operation was over. They told Marcus that Victor had met with a woman in Columbus, that the meeting had lasted less than an hour, that it had been carefully staged to appear ordinary. Coffee,
conversation, a public place. The kind of meeting designed to disappear into the background of everyday life. It did not. The agents told Marcus that documents had been exchanged. They did not describe them in detail. They did not need to. The woman had been arrested first, quietly, without resistance.
Victor was taken shortly afterward. According to the agents, he had not struggled. He had not protested. He had known, Marcus realized, long before anyone told him. Years of patience did not end in surprise. They end in acceptance. Marcus sat alone in his apartment after the call. The city outside moving through a normal afternoon he could not quite enter. He felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a hollow sense of finality. The voice that had filled his nights for years would not return. Victor would not call again. The radio booth would remain. The microphone would remain. But the familiarity that once made the night feel smaller had vanished. Marcus returned to work that evening. He took calls from strangers, played songs requested by people he would never meet, spoke gently into the darkness. The phone line Victor once favored stayed silent. Marcus realized then that the most unsettling part of the entire experience was not the espionage. It was how easily it had blended into ordinary life, how close it had come without revealing itself. The world had not changed when Victor was arrested. Only Marcus had. The days that followed passed without ceremony. There were no press conferences. No headlines that Marcus saw. No sudden explanations offered to the public. The arrests happened quietly, the way most intelligence work ends. Clean. Contained. Marcus was instructed not to discuss anything. Not with colleagues. Not with friends. Officially, nothing unusual had occurred. That was the part he struggled with most. The radio station continued operating as it always had. Music schedules were updated. Commercials aired on time. Listeners called in to fill the night with ordinary concerns. To them, Victor had simply stopped calling. Marcus returned to the booth each evening with the same practiced routine. He adjusted the microphone. He stacked records. He spoke into the darkness. But the intimacy he once allowed himself was gone. He no longer lingered in conversations. No longer let discussions drift too far from the surface. It was not fear that guided him now. It was restraint. Marcus had learned that voices could perform sincerity without being honest. That warmth could coexist with deception. That familiarity did not guarantee truth. Weeks passed. Winter softened into early spring. Snow retreated from the sidewalks. The river moved faster as temperatures rose. And still, Victor did not return. Marcus sometimes found himself waiting for the familiar cadence of his voice, even as he told himself it would never come. The habit was difficult to break. One afternoon, months later, an agent contacted him again. This time the call carried no urgency. They told Marcus the case was closed. Victor would be exchanged at a later date. The woman who had met him would face trial. Marcus asked no questions. Details felt unnecessary now. Before ending the call, the agent mentioned one more thing. Victor had left something for him. A letter. It had been reviewed.
Cleared. Deemed safe. The envelope arrived days later. Marcus recognized the handwriting immediately. Careful. Deliberate. The same precision Victor used when choosing words on air. The letter was brief. Victor wrote that their conversations had been real to him. That books, architecture, and poetry were not tools, but refuges. That the radio show had been one of the few places where he felt allowed to speak without calculation. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He thanked Marcus. Marcus read the letter once. Then again. He folded it carefully and placed it in a desk drawer, where it would remain. He did not know whether the words represented honesty or one final performance. He suspected the truth lay somewhere in between. That ambiguity felt fitting. Life settled into a new pattern. Marcus continued working the overnight shift for years afterward. The city changed around him. The radio station eventually changed formats. Victor's voice became a memory tied to a specific frequency of time. Sometimes late at night, Marcus would catch himself pausing between records, listening to the quiet as if expecting something familiar to surface again. It never did. And yet the experience stayed with him. It shaped how he listened, how he spoke, how much of himself he allowed to pass through the microphone. He understood now that the Cold War had not only been fought in capitals and backrooms. It had passed through ordinary places, through voices, through moments that felt harmless at the time. The radio waves that once carried companionship had also carried uncertainty. Marcus had been a small part of that machinery. Briefly. Unwillingly. But the impact had been lasting. The night no longer felt empty. It felt watched. The Cold War did not end all at once. It faded. Tension softened. Borders shifted. Stories that once carried urgency slipped quietly into archives and footnotes. For most people, it became history. For Marcus Holbrook, it became memory. He remained at WKRF for years after Victor disappeared from the phone lines. The overnight shift suited him still, though it no longer felt the same. He kept conversation shorter, safer, professional. Listeners came and went, voices replacing voices, each one passing briefly through the booth before dissolving back into the night. Marcus never again allowed himself to build the kind of familiarity he once had with Victor. Not because he believed every caller hid a secret, but because he understood how easily meaning could be projected onto sound, how intimacy could exist without truth. The radio station itself did not last. Years later, the old building near the riverfront was demolished. Condos rose where the booth had once stood. The frequencies were reassigned. The equipment scrapped or sold. The voices that once filled the night air vanished without trace. Marcus retired quietly. He never spoke publicly about his role. No one ever asked him to. To the outside world, he remained a former radio host. Someone who had worked long nights in a different era. On a frequency few remembered. Years later, after his death, his daughter sorted through what he left behind. Old photographs. Paperwork. Objects that carried stories without explanation. At the bottom of a drawer, she found a small envelope. Inside was a letter written in careful handwriting. Its context unclear. She read it once. Then again. The tone puzzled her. The intimacy between two men she had never heard mentioned felt out of place, and yet deliberate. She placed the letter back where she had found it, among other fragments of a life she could only partially reconstruct. That was how the Cold War endured. Not through monuments, not through speeches, but through unanswered questions, through connections that never fully explained themselves. Somewhere long ago, a Soviet intelligence officer had spoken honestly into a microphone while living a lie everywhere else. Somewhere, a radio host had offered companionship, without knowing the cost. Neither had chosen the roles they ultimately played. They had simply spoken and listened in the quiet hours when most of the world slept. Ordinary conversations had briefly intersected with global forces far beyond either man's control. The radio waves carried more than music that night. They carried trust. They carried deception. They carried the fragile space between what is said and what is meant. When the voices fell silent, the questions remained. And perhaps that was the truest legacy of the Cold War. Not answers, but echoes.